fresheners in the car, finances, a possible security guard. Not only are we going to get into the substance of the morning session of this hearing, but our reporter got very close to David in court, and what she observed was interesting. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law and Crime. I'm Jesse Weber.
He was a rising star with a platinum voice and millions of streams until a decomposing body turned up in the front trunk of his Tesla. Today, inside a Los Angeles courtroom, the man behind that voice sat almost motionless as prosecutors laid out evidence meant to send him to trial for murder. And by the end of the day, even the state's own medical examiner couldn't answer the one question everyone wanted solved: what actually killed her? This is the preliminary hearing for David Anthony Burke, the 21-year-old musician known to millions as D4vd.
Okay, so we got day 2 of this preliminary hearing in the David case. Remember, he's facing first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, unlawful mutilation of human remains charges, all in connection with the death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, whose decomposed, dismembered body was allegedly found in the front trunk of a Tesla, allegedly registered to him. This was back in September of 2025. This is a hearing where the court will determine
now
if there's
facing
enough
first-degree murder, continuous sexual abuse of a child under 14, and unlawful mutilation of human remains. The victim is 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez, whose body was found dismembered and decomposing inside a vehicle registered to Burke back in September of last year. A preliminary hearing exists for one reason: to determine whether prosecutors have enough evidence to send this case to trial. It is not a conviction, it is not an acquittal. It is the state's first real test of its case. And over the past several days, that test has produced some of the most disturbing and legally complicated testimony seen in a Los Angeles courtroom in years. Let's set the stage. Burke sits at the defense table in an Orange County jail jumpsuit, his hair grown out, his face unshaven.
I did, Jesse, but first, I just want to tell you again, it is such a treat to be on this show with you because I love watching it. So yes, I was sitting right behind David this morning. I somehow got a seat in front of where they were seating other reporters. I think it's because I actually walked in a little bit later than everybody else did. So because of that, they had me seated on the end of one of the attorneys' rows in that courtroom, and I was right behind David. He didn't look too great. You know, his hair is grown out. He is unshaven. He's wearing that LA County jail uniform, that orange jumpsuit, and he still has his feet and his waist shackled. He's not wearing handcuffs, though, so he was kind of splayed out in his chair, arms on his armrests. I could see his yellow legal notepad that he had laid out in front of him, so I was trying to take a peek, trying to see if he was taking any notes. He didn't have anything written down.
He is not handcuffed. His attorneys successfully argued for that, but his ankles and waist remain shackled beneath the table. Reporters who have watched him for days describe the same thing over and over. He barely moves. He stares straight ahead. Courtroom sketch artists, the only visual record allowed since cameras are banned from the room, describe his expression as somewhere between detached and unreadable.
Break during lunch, and she said it looks to her like he couldn't care less about what happens. There's kind of a glib manner to how he's moving and how he's interacting with his team and how he's kind of just staring straight ahead. So I asked her, is this typical? You've been through hundreds of criminal trials. You've sketched probably more criminal defendants than you could count. Have you seen this before? And she kind of nodded and said, yeah, I've seen this. So other people I've talked to, words they've used about David's demeanor in that courtroom, they've described it as off, as sociopathic. We've only heard him speak a couple times, just, yes, Your Honor, or I understand. And he's dressed in the
More than one observer has used the word sociopathic to describe how little emotion crosses his face, even when autopsy photographs of a child's remains are projected onto the courtroom screen. That emotional distance becomes the backbone of everything that follows because the prosecution's entire strategy rests on painting a portrait of calculation. A young man who had everything to lose and who allegedly went to extraordinary lengths to make sure no one found out what he'd done. Start with the motive prosecutors are building.
Talk to his attorneys. The first time I noticed that, it was during cross-examination related to financial management. They were essentially talking about how much money he made through his record deal and how that money was divvied up. Because so many people were involved in this operation. So many people were making money off of him, to put it bluntly. And that's a key part of this case, because murder for financial gain is one of the special circumstances here that makes this eligible for the death penalty. But the district attorney, Nathan Hochman, did say yesterday they haven't actually decided yet if that's something they're going to pursue.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the idea is, and I'm going to get to the witnesses who testified today, if they can show how lucrative his career was at $11.5 million, that if Celeste came out and exposed him for this alleged illegal sexual
Burke's music career had reportedly generated more than $11.5 million. That number matters because murder for financial gain is one of the special circumstances that could make this case eligible for the death penalty, though prosecutors have said they haven't yet decided whether to pursue it. The implication is straightforward and brutal. If Celeste had come forward about an alleged illegal relationship with a man years older than her, it could have ended everything he'd built. Then comes the
testimony from an LAPD criminologist. This was one of the officers called to investigate after the Tesla was towed to one of their tech centers. So we were looking at photos the prosecutor was showing the court of 11 different air fresheners that were found in that Tesla. I mean, Celeste's remains had been in there decomposing, likely for months. So to cover up that smell, somebody put nearly a dozen air fresheners, not just inside the car, but actually in the front trunk.
Yeah.
And that's where the cadaver bags with her remains were found. So it's not just that this crime was committed, it's that somebody went to truly horrifying lengths, Jesse, to try and cover
Investigators
up.
say they found not one or two, but 11 separate air fresheners scattered throughout that Tesla, inside the cabin in the back seats, and most damning of all, inside the front trunk itself, the same space where Celeste's remains were eventually located inside sealed bags. 11 air fresheners is not an accident. It is not a coincidence. It is, prosecutors argue, evidence of someone actively trying to mask the smell of a body decomposing for months. And then there's the blood.
There was a lot of evidence talking about what could be presumed as blood. Inside the Tesla, in the garage, there's this blue star technology. And if you've seen pictures of it in other cases, you have kind of this blue splatter on the wall after they put a chemical down. And they say that that is presumably where blood once was. Of course, when you think of Celeste, her remains were allegedly found in the front trunk of this Tesla. But that's not the only place where law enforcement is now alleging where they found blood in the car. What stood out to you about that part of the testimony today?
That's right. That was the key part of the testimony today from the prosecution's witnesses. So we did start wrapping up testimony from yesterday relating to financial management and just how much money David was making. And then we heard from a CHP officer who testified about where Celeste's passport ID was found months after her body was found. That was up in Santa Barbara County. And then we heard from two LAPD staffers. They are criminalists. One was the primary criminalist who processed the scene with the Tesla, and the other was involved in the search of David's house up in the Hollywood Hills a couple days after the body was found on September 17th of last year. So this is what was new and what was really interesting, Chris. We haven't heard about this detail before. According to this testimony from one of those two LAPD criminalists, there was actually blood identified in the brick flooring underneath where a car would have been parked. And that was underneath black rubber mats that were laid down on the garage floor in David's house. So what they seem to be painting a picture of here is blood leaking out of David's Tesla, seeping through those
Investigators used a chemical luminescent technique to detect blood traces not just inside the vehicle, but seeping through the garage floor at Burke's Hollywood Hills home, beneath rubber mats laid down over brick flooring. The implication prosecutors want a jury to draw is chilling in its simplicity: blood leaking from the car, soaking through the mats, staining the ground beneath them. Add to that the discovery of jugs of fake blood in that same garage.
In this testimony.
Look, as shocking as a case like this is, it is not a shock that there would be blood or presumed traces of blood at a crime scene. But what about fake blood? That is not something we were expecting, but it is one of the pieces of information we learned about today in David's preliminary hearing. Investigators say they found jugs of fake blood in the singer's garage. We'll talk a little bit about why the singer may have
detail
had that.
Investigators flagged, and one the defense will almost certainly try to explain away before this is over. But here's where the case gets complicated and where the defense has found real ground to fight on. 2 chainsaws were recovered from Burke's home.
So we ended yesterday with cross-examination of an LAPD criminalist. She was the one who was called to process evidence found in David's garage. And that evidence included everything from trash bags to rubber floor mats to bloodstains. She was the one who tested chainsaws found in David's house. This was just about a week after the car was found in the Hollywood tow yard with the victim's remains in the front trunk, of course. So they continued with that cross-examination, and there was a lot of back and forth about the chainsaws. And here's why. Defense attorney Blair Burke noted there was no positive test indicating the possibility of blood on those chainsaws, so she kept on asking this LAPD witness for the prosecution why they didn't take those chainsaws into evidence. It sounded like she wanted to make the point that touch DNA, which they didn't test for, may have indicated something else, may have painted a more comprehensive picture of what exactly happened and who may have been involved, who else may have been involved, that is. But the criminalist was very sharp, very clear with her answers. At one point yesterday, she even brought her notes back out to make sure that she gave precisely the information that was documented during this investigation. So she said there did not appear to be any kind of forensic value to those chainsaws that were found in the garage, and that's why they were not taken into evidence. So my big takeaway from all of this is that perhaps those were not the weapons or tools used for dismemberment, even though they were found in David's garage during this search.
Let me just clarify this point, just so it's clear for our audience. I heard there was reporting, maybe even testimony, about a missing chainsaw. I don't know if that's accurate.
Yeah.
And what about any evidence of a cleanup, including of the chainsaws? Correct me if I'm wrong about either of those points.
Correct on the first point. There was another chainsaw, a Makita brand chainsaw that we talked about the other day that was ordered online and delivered to David's house. As far as I know, from the evidence presented so far, that chainsaw was not located during this search. The 2 other chainsaws, and here's why the criminalist said there really was no forensic value. She testified earlier that had they been used for dismemberment, there would have been no way for blood to be cleaned up to the point where their testing did not indicate something of forensic value. So when they did that initial test on scene and there was no presumptive positive, they elected not to take those 2 chainsaws into evidence. But yes, there is a missing one. There is another one, and I'm sure that's going to come up later in this testimony.
Neither tested positive for blood. The lead criminalist testified that if those chainsaws had been used to dismember a body, there was no scenario in which all forensic trace evidence could have been cleaned away that thoroughly. In other words, these specific chainsaws, according to the state's own witness, likely weren't the tools used. There is, however, a 3rd chainsaw, ordered online, delivered to the house, that has never been found. Missing evidence is exactly the kind of gap a defense team lives for. The DNA testimony delivered numbers that sound almost impossible to challenge, statistical probabilities involving figures with 4 zeros trailing the first digit.
The afternoon, going through that testimony, it started with questions from Deputy DA Beth Silverman. It was her witness. Samantha Tosh, an LAPD criminalist who's from the LAPD crime lab, who is responsible for testing, analyzing, and reporting on DNA samples. And then defense attorneys did their cross-examination, and then that witness went back to the prosecution, and then defense had more questions for her. So what all of that adds up to is a lot of information that can be looked at different ways, right? None of this is actually definitive. And the witness, the LAPD criminalist, was careful to make that clear. You know, she's using language like possible or probable. but the statistics that she laid out, and we're talking about figures, right, with 24 zeros after the first digit. She laid out statistics that make it unlikely, if not close to impossible, for these DNA matches to be from anybody but Celeste. Now the question is, where is that DNA match actually coming from? Is it definitively coming from blood, or could it be something like skin? Because she spent time living in that house and touching items in the garage. That's what defense attorneys spent quite a bit of time today questioning, going back and forth with that one witness. If this does go to trial, I think we can expect a lot more of that, Chris.
And there's so many pieces of evidence, I feel like, Julia, as like this has gone on for the last couple of days, where from a circumstantial standpoint, it seems incredibly strong for the prosecution, but then you'll have David's defense attorneys come back and just nitpick every single word of what a witness said. As far as some of where DNA was found, there were blood stains in the Tesla, and through just kind of going through some of these notes, that there was a toenail that was Celeste, and then they were able to create a DNA profile on that. But then you get into these trash bags, I believe, that were found at David's house, right? And then there are these wipes in the trash bag, and like it does not get, to me, it came off just kind of going through this, like it's muddied and it's not clear who is handling what inside the house. And there's even some DNA on there that may be from other people. We don't know. Like, what did you make of kind of all of those different layers to what seems like a really complicated part of the story that the prosecution's trying to tell?
When I first heard some of that DNA evidence from the LAPD witness when the prosecution was questioning her, I felt like it was incredibly compelling evidence. I mean, you can't question something with a statistical probability that's got 24 zeros behind the first digit, right?
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
I guess if you are Blair Burke, you can question that. And she raised a couple hypotheticals about that compelling DNA evidence. She actually laid out a scenario about tertiary transfer, right? She told the court, what if I shook my co-counsel's hand and then I touched the podium and then the judge put her notebook down on the podium, right? Could my co-counsel's DNA then end up being transferred to that notebook? And the witness answered that on the stand. Yes.
Virtually
That's a
eliminating any possibility the biological material belonged to anyone other than Celeste. But numbers that overwhelming don't answer where that DNA came from. Was it blood? Or could it simply be skin cells, deposited naturally by a teenager who spent time in that house? The defense pressed hard on a concept called tertiary transfer. The idea that DNA can move from person to another surface entirely by accident, without anyone doing anything wrong. It's a legitimate scientific principle, and it's now sitting inside the record of this case, ready to be used again if this reaches trial. Then the hearing reached its most consequential witness, the deputy medical examiner who performed Celeste's autopsy, and what he said, or rather, what he couldn't say, may be the single most important development of this entire proceeding.
This is what we were waiting for. What did Dr. Grant Ho say about the cause and manner of death of Celeste Rivas Hernandez?
There is a lot of back and forth during this cross-examination now of Dr. Grant Ho, but he repeated findings from the medical examiner's office that have already been published. This was released months ago. We have reported on this, but he walked us through, with the support of visuals this time that we have not previously seen from the autopsy. He walked us through what they already found months ago. They decided the cause and manner of death of 14-year-old Celeste Rivas Hernandez was homicide, and they attributed her death to multiple penetrating injuries. Here's what's interesting, though. They did not identify what kind of weapon or tool caused those penetrating injuries. And they stopped short of actually calling it a penetrating injury caused by a sharp instrument. So they're not saying that she was definitely stabbed to death. And that's because of the advanced state of decomposition. They simply don't know for sure exactly how or what caused a lot of what they found, which we are looking at right now in the courtroom, documented in in these very, very visual exhibits.
Let me tell you why that's so significant. You know, but our audience should know. One of the special circumstance allegations in this case that has been presented by prosecutors is that David Anthony Burke personally used a deadly and dangerous weapon, a sharp instrument, to commit this crime. And yet what you're telling us is this deputy medical examiner can't definitively say that that's the case.
We don't know that for sure. And I think defense attorneys made a point of underscoring that several times. That is one of the elements of this first-degree felony murder charge that is interesting, that is different, right? And if he is convicted, there could be a sharp instrument enhancement. I believe in the state of California,
the manner of death is officially ruled a homicide. The cause is listed as multiple penetrating injuries. But the medical examiner testified that due to the advanced state of decomposition, he cannot say for certain that those injuries came from a knife or any sharp instrument. He cannot say which of the two wounds happened first. He cannot say how much time passed between them. He cannot rule out a gunshot wound with an exit point.
They might be suggesting, can you definitively say she died on that night in April? What about this whole back and forth about a gunshot wound?
This was interesting, too, because this was new. And Dr. Ho just clarified on the stand before we broke for lunch that his way of saying anything could have happened to inflict what he'd observed on her ribs, damage to one of her left ribs, that could have come from anything. He cannot say with certainty that it came from a knife or another sharp instrument. And the reason, again, that they attributed her death to penetrating wounds as opposed to a sharp instrument is because they cannot rule out a possible gunshot wound.
And in one of the more startling exchanges of the hearing, when defense counsel asked whether he could definitively rule out the possibility that Celeste inflicted those wounds herself, his answer was no. He could not rule that out.
Here's what else the deputy medical examiner doesn't know for sure. And defense leaned really hard into all of this on cross. They don't know which penetrating injury occurred first. There's one on the victim's abdomen, and there's one on her lateral left chest. So one is associated possibly with liver damage, the other possibly with rib damage and diaphragm damage. Deputy Emmy can't say which one happened first. He can't say definitively whether or not they may have happened seconds apart. He cannot say which one caused her death. He cannot say how long it may have taken Celeste to die from either one of those injuries. There's so much we simply don't know. And that created a gap for one of the defense attorneys to ask something that we have not heard yet in this case. She asked this witness, this deputy medical examiner, if he could rule out that Celeste may have inflicted both of these stab wounds on her own. And he said, based on his findings in this autopsy, that was not something that he could definitively rule out. The reaction in the courtroom following that line of questioning, though, I turned around and I could see a couple people, glancing at each other, eyebrows raised. It looked and felt to me like people watching this line of questioning felt like it may have been bordering on the absurd. It may not be something a jury would believe.
Let that sit for a second. This is not a defense theory pulled from thin air. This is testimony extracted directly from the prosecution's own expert witness. One of the special circumstance allegations here depends on Burke personally using a deadly weapon to commit this crime, and the person whose job it is to determine exactly that cannot confirm it happened at all. This is precisely why a preliminary hearing exists.
The threshold here in this preliminary hearing phase is much lower. The prosecution only needs to show a probable cause. Think of that as kind of like a 51% threshold. But if this does go to trial, in order for a jury to convict, that's got to be beyond a reasonable doubt. Think of that as more like a 99.9%.
The burden here is probable cause, often described as just over a 50% threshold, nowhere near the beyond a reasonable doubt standard required for an actual conviction. prosecutors likely still clear that bar. But every uncertainty entered into this record today becomes ammunition for a defense team building toward trial, where the standard is exponentially higher. None of this changes the fact that a 14-year-old girl is dead, her body found dismembered inside a car, her parents forced to sit through images no parent should ever see.
Anywhere. But being, in that courtroom with the victim's parents, I think that drives home the point that this is about a human, this is about a teenager, this is about a girl who was killed and dismembered. This is about justice for her.
Legal ambiguity about a weapon does not equal innocence, and it should never be mistaken for it. What it does mean is that this case, however overwhelming the circumstantial picture may look right now, is far from a guaranteed conviction, and the next phase of this hearing is going to matter enormously. If you want the accountability this case demands, don't look away now. Subscribe, stay with this coverage, and let's see whether the evidence holds up when it finally reaches a jury.